What I want to do in this lesson is spend some time talking about the government and opposition, specifically with reference, of course, to Weimar Germany and the Weimar Republic. Now, specifically, what we're going to do is talk about government and opposition from 1918 to 1924. This involves an examination of the post-war political problems, the attempted coups and opposition from both the far left and the far right in Weimar Germany, the occupation of the Ruhr and the aftermath that this had, as well as the inner workings and the strengths and weaknesses of the Weimar government. And it should be noted that the period of Weimar Germany between 1918-1919 to 1924, we see that the Weimar Republic faces severe challenges. It struggles to establish itself following Germany's defeat in World War I. It was marked by a period of economic crisis, of political instability, and of violent opposition from both the far left and the far right. And we can see that the defeat of the First World War and the subsequent Treaty of Versailles leaves Germany with not only the loss of territory, but also with economic hardships and a sense of humiliation and resentment among the population. And so the context of the post-World War I German state cannot be viewed without reference to the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was concluded in 1919, and it placed full responsibility of the war for World War I on Germany. This is the war guilt clause. The result of that was that because Germany was responsible, they were guilty for starting World War I, that this means that they had to pay reparations. These reparations payments put severe strain on Germany's already struggling economy, and would ultimately contribute to both widespread poverty, but also a hyperinflation crisis. We'll get to hyperinflation in a second. In addition to this, Germany was stripped of key territories. This includes Alsace-Lorraine, it includes Saar Basin, and it includes areas within East Prussia. These losses were perceived as, again, humiliating, and many of those who many of those who were in German society argued that the people who signed the Armistice Agreement and by extension supported the Weimar Republic, they were labelled as November criminals, or they were the people who stabbed the German people in the back. This narrative of betrayal, this stab in the back myth, would ultimately fuel right-wing extremism and anti-republican sentiment for years that would follow. Many Germans viewed the Weimar government as illegitimate and held it responsible for the Treaty of Versailles. Again, this contributes to this feeling of resentment, which fuels extremism from both radical groups on the left and radical groups on the right. Specifically with relation to society and the economy, in an attempt to try and deal with the reparations payments and the war debts as a result of the Treaty of Versailles and the result of World War I generally, by 1923, the German mark, the German currency, was practically worthless, with prices rising exponentially. This is known as a hyperinflation crisis. We all have inflation. Inflation is set at or at least aimed to be set at a certain rate, and this is just essentially, you can measure inflation through a couple of different ways, but in this case, let's just measure inflation as the value of a particular currency. Hyperinflation is where you basically have the currency, the value of that currency deflating, or inflating, should I say, or shall I say, the value deflating and therefore the price of goods inflating at a hyper rate. So it gets to a point where things like the loaf of bread is costing trillions and trillions of marks. Now, the middle class in particular would be hit by the hyperinflation crisis because, of course, if you're somebody who has savings, for example, if you had life savings, they become financially worthless if the value of those savings drops at an exponential rate. By contrast, then, those who are in debt and those who had mortgages and things like that would actually benefit from the hyperinflation crisis. Because let's say they owe 10,000 marks. Well, in a week's time, 10,000 marks becomes completely worthless and you get given a million marks, and you can pay off your debts very, very quickly. So people who were creditors also lost out, but people who were in debt were able to essentially pay off their debts with relative ease. Now, in addition to this, of course, the economic collapse results in high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, high levels of homelessness, all of which further eroding support for the Weimar government. Many Germans suffering from poor living conditions and unable to find work would then turn to extremist parties that promised quick and radical solutions to their problems. And so it is the different extremist parties that we will turn to now. The early Weimar period saw multiple attempts on the parts of both the left and the right to try and overthrow the government, with all of them threatening the stability of the Republic itself. Left-wing opposition was most prominently illustrated in January 1919 with the Spartacist uprising. This was the most prominent left-wing threat, and it came as the result of a radical socialist faction led by people like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. And in 1919, in January 1919, they launched an uprising in Berlin, hoping to establish a communist regime similar to that of the Russian Bolsheviks in 1917. However, the revolt was very poorly organised, and it would be very quickly suppressed by the government. The government would rely on paramilitary groups which were composed of former soldiers. These were known as Freikorps, and they crushed the opposition. The violent suppression led to the deaths of both Liebknecht and Luxemburg, and it fueled resentment within the left and created a lasting rift between the SDP, the Social Democrats, who supported the Weimar Constitution, and the more radicalist socialist groups. In addition to this, we see further left-wing uprisings in the Ruhr. So in 1920 and 1921, left-wing uprisings occur in this Ruhr region in central Germany as workers and leftist groups attempted to seize power. These uprisings reflected the ongoing dissatisfaction with the working class, within the working class, should I say, and the challenges the Republic faced, especially when it comes to the eventual occupation of the Ruhr Valley and the Ruhr region later on in this period. When we see the right-wing groups, then, the first of these was in March 1920 with the Kapp Putsch. This was a group of right-wing nationalists and Freikorps members who attempted to overthrow the Weimar government in what became known as the Kapp Putsch. Now, the Kapp Putsch and the Bierhall Putsch, which is cited underneath, are both right-wing, but they're right-wing in different ways. So the Kapp Putsch was led by Wolfgang Kapp, and he was somebody who supported and gained support through elements of the military. And the aim was to establish a regime similar to that of the previous aristocratic autocratic monarchy. So it was a military coup, and it was a military coup that existed as the result of one of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which was to disband many military corps. They refused and led to the Kapp Putsch. The putsch itself was thwarted, however, by a general strike organised by trade unions and leftist parties. What this ultimately did was paralyse Berlin, and it prevented these putschers from gaining and consolidating control. And the failure of the Kapp Putsch demonstrated the influence of organised labour movements, but it also underscores that there was a key vulnerability of right-wing violence. By contrast, then, a far more organised and more prevalent example of right-wing opposition was that of the November 1923 Munich Putsch, or Bierhall Putsch. This was with the support of the leader of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, in support of General Erich Ludendorff. These both attempted to seize power in Munich through a Bierhall Putsch. Although the putsch failed, what it did was it heightened and highlighted the growing threat that was posed by the far right within German society, especially the influence of Hitler and the Nazis. Now, potentially, if Hitler never actually would come to rise to power, and if he sort of began his claim to fame here and it ended here, where he was sentenced as the result of this putsch, then potentially this would not have the same kind of historical significance as it later does, because of course this is just the first of the attempts on the part of Adolf Hitler to gain control within Germany. The second attempt he would ultimately be successful in doing. One of the things that was really important about the Beer Hall Putsch was the fact that his arrest and subsequent trial gave Adolf Hitler the platform to promote nationalist anti-Semitic ideas, and especially those that attacked those who supported the Treaty of Versailles and supported the Weimar government, the November criminals, the stab in the back myth, all of these different kinds of things. The occupation of the Ruhr began in 1923, and it was an occupation that began as the result of French and Belgian forces, and it was one of the most significant crises that faced the Weimar government and further destabilized the economy. The reason for the occupation of the Ruhr was that by early 1923, Germany had defaulted on a number of its reparations payments. Essentially, it was unable to keep up with the reparations payments as set by the Treaty of Versailles. It was set in 1921. So the Treaty of Versailles basically in 1919 concludes that reparations payments would be made, and then the amount of reparations payments was set in 1921. In response to defaulting on these payments, the French and Belgian forces occupied the Ruhr Valley, which was the German industrial heartland, as an attempt to extract reparations directly by seizing raw materials and goods. The policy that was in response to the occupation was not one of military force, because under Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, the German government responded by encouraging a campaign of what was known as passive resistance. Essentially, German workers in the Ruhr were instructed to go on strike and to refuse to cooperate with the occupying forces in response to instead of using military force. The government promised to support the strikes financially, which led to significant increases in government spending and further exacerbated the already existing inflation and hyperinflation crisis. The Ruhr occupation intensifies the hyperinflation crisis, as the government decided to try and print more and more money in order to try and support these striking workers and to try and pay off reparations payments. The mark value plummeted and the prices of ordinary goods began to soar, and we see that middle class saw their savings wiped out, which led to widespread social despair. In addition to this, the occupation of the Ruhr and the resulting hyperinflation crisis further eroded the public confidence in the Weimar government. Many Germans, particularly from those in the middle class, felt betrayed and they saw the government as ineffective. This further fuels the growth of extremist parties like the Nazis, like the KPD, the Communist Party, and promoted a strong sense of German humiliation in the face of these policies being imposed upon them. And so really, when we get to the end of this lesson, we should think a little bit about the Weimar government, the strengths and the weaknesses of them. And I know that we've spoken about this a little bit in the previous lesson, but the government structure of the Weimar Republic, as outlined in the Weimar Constitution, still had a number of strengths. And we will actually see these strengths be illustrated and utilized when we look at the period of 1924 to 1929. This was a period that we sometimes describe as the golden age of the Weimar Republic. And this is where things sort of calmed down quite a lot. This is where things sort of started to stabilize. The economy was starting to get back on track, and the position of Germany in international relations was starting to improve. In terms of the strengths of the Weimar Constitution, as we noted in the previous lesson, it provided a democratic framework for Germany. This included the universal suffrage of everybody over the age of, I believe, 21 or 25 potentially, proportional representation, and a system of checks and balances. It also protected individual rights, it established social protections, and it made it one of the most progressive constitutions of its time. The electoral system was proportional, which meant that the percentage of votes a particular party got roughly matched the percentage of seats that they would gain in the Reichstag. This inclusivity was an attempt to prevent disenfranchisement and to create a government that reflected German social values and political makeup. The Weimar government also implemented a number of social reforms. We see this a little bit more when we get into the Golden Age period, but these reforms intended to reduce the support for leftist extremism specifically, but also right-wing extremism, by addressing social grievances directly. So there were definitely parts of this constitutional framework that was good, that was definitely positive, but there were still problematic elements within this constitution. Because firstly, while proportional representation was a more inclusive system and a more democratic system at least, it led to political fragmentation. It made it difficult for any one party to gain a majority in the Reichstag. And the result of this was that governments were often led by coalitions. Coalitions, as we mentioned in the previous lesson, had a frequency to be unstable. And so this led to short-lived administrations and policy and paralysis. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution was a particularly controversial addition because what it did was it granted the president to have emergency powers. We will get to this later on, but we know that ultimately when President Hindenburg gets elected, he would utilize the Article 48 powers to essentially create a loophole for potential authoritarian rule and bypass the Reichstag. You also have the fact that there was a lack of support from the elites. The Republic lacked broad support from members of the military, the judiciary, and business leaders. Many of these elites opposed the democratic principles of the Republic and were more supportive of the previously established authoritarian regimes that we saw, or I say authoritarian, autocratic regimes that we saw under the Imperial state with Wilhelm II. So all of these things are problematic elements, and we will get to a period of relative stability, however, and this sort of gives us a nice little indication of what happens in the next lesson. The next lesson will talk about the period of 1924 to 1929, but the period of relative stability begins in 1923, towards the end of 1923. Gustav Stresemann, who is somebody who you will become familiar with in the next lesson, and who was a particularly influential and astute politician, would become German Chancellor in 1923. And his policies would help to stabilize the economy and also end the Ruhr crisis. He would call off passive resistance in the Ruhr. He will introduce a new currency, the Rentenmark, to try and curb hyperinflation, and he will renegotiate reparations payments with Allied forces, leading to the establishment of the Dawes Plan and the subsequent Young Plan in 1924 and 1928 respectively, and ultimately begins to put Germany on a perspective of in a position of relative strength. He will also start to work with the international relations side of policy making. Not only was he Chancellor, but he also serves for a time as Foreign Minister, and he will improve Germany's diplomatic standing with negotiations such as that of the Treaty of Kiel-Briand and the Treaty of Locarno and all these different kinds of things, and ultimately leads to Germany entering into the League of Nations. All of that we'll get to in the next lesson.